All right. Well, welcome, Cindy. I am so excited to have you here to participate in the leadership conversation. Really, what does the playbook look like? What are the trends? What are the key signatures of excellence? And really, you've got so much expertise over both corporate as well as at a school level, as well as for advocacy. And your reputation precedes you, and we're so grateful for you to be here joining us in this important conversation and helping bring your knowledge and expertise to others in the industry. So,
Well, thank
welcome.
you. And I appreciate having this opportunity to share the learnings that I have had over many years because, most of us learn by doing. And so ultimately, I've had a lot of doing and so a lot of learning. And I'm always open to learning new things myself. And one of the things I've often told leaders that have worked with and mentored and coached is that I hope to learn as much from them as they learn from me.
I love it. I love it. Perfect segue to the first topic I want to dig into. And it's around this idea of continuous learning, continuous improvement. So, the childcare industry is constantly looking at ways to improve. And I've heard this quote. I can't say who exactly it came from, but it's you can tell what people care about by what's on their calendar and where they're spending their money,
Hmm.
right? So it's where are they spending their time? Where are they spending money? And when it comes to continuous improvement, maybe you could talk about the top three things that you're seeing in this area of continuous improvement and why that's so important. And there's lots of areas under this heading, but I'm kind of zeroing in on what you see as kind of the top three priorities at this
Okay,
moment.
well, one of the things that I just really want to emphasize, as long as talking about the top three things, is that leaders are lifelong learners. You absolutely
Yes.
cannot stop learning. If you aren't able to change, you can't survive. And I think that's
Yes.
even more true in an industry like ours that has evolved over the last 50 years to be very different. I mean, it simply started out as babysitting and daycare, and it has evolved into early care and education. And ultimately, I think the biggest change, first came in the late 80s, and that was when we learned about brain research and the importance of how children, young children, are helped in their development because of the brain development. And ultimately, we have moved towards, learning how to help children that are in stressful situations and have gone through
Oh, yes.
trauma. And if we start early enough, we can help them become more successful adults. And I think the other thing that has really been evolving and that we're educating people on is how to get the attention of our legislators and the powers that be on the importance of funding the early
Yes.
childhood and care sector of the United States because we still are very underfunded. But we're underfunded because we have not established a large enough voice and a unified voice for that to occur. So, and
Yes.
certainly the pandemic was a horrific event in our lifetime. However, it also shed a huge light on the essentialness of early care and education, if for no other reason, so that our families who need to work can go to work. And so that has been added to the learnings and also is being used as an approach to reach our legislators. And the other beauty of what came out of uh, the pandemic was that we've extended learning opportunities. I mean, there are so many ways to learn now that weren't available when I started my career in
Yes,
1980. So you don't have to leave your home to receive training or to receive new knowledge. However, there are still opportunities that are fortunately back out there for attending conferences and in person trainings. There are so many wonderful experts out there that are doing what needs to be done to teach others what they've learned, just like myself.
yes,
And so uh, people have to stay involved in this. It's hard sometimes to make time, but with webinars and virtual training, you can do it in your own time. You can, and so there's just
agreed.
so many ways. So there's really no excuse for people to say that I don't have time to do this. And the bottom line is they also need to stay involved with organizations that um, revolve around this industry so that they stay informed of what's being decided for them. Because as
Agreed.
professionals, we need for them to step up, the professionals, the experience, the boots on the ground, and help be a guide. So, in order to do that, a guide for changes. So, in order to do that, they have to involve themselves in organizations that can also teach them what's happening while we're all watching and educating the children.
That's exactly right. And I've sat in on a number of the National Child Care Association webinars. And oftentimes we think of our advocates like yourself and our legislators as being the voice, but it's actually me. I can actually be a voice. An owner can be a voice. Get involved, speak with your representatives, participate in your local child care association. And I think that advocacy work has just grown in leaps and bounds in the last 2 years. So bravo to all of you of helping people who think, well, I'm not necessarily that voice or I'm not comfortable doing that. Yes, you are. You're capable because, and I'm going to quote you if I'm paraphrasing, but one of the conversations we had, you said to me, if you do what's right for the children, you're doing what's right for the business.
Absolutely. I have spent my whole career preaching that, and I've had a number of people who have actually thanked me for teaching them that. And then I thank them for proving it because ultimately that's one of the things that I was questioned on early in my advocacy career by a legislator uh, in Oklahoma who I was kind of drug into advocating when I was a district manager for a group of 8 schools um, by someone who felt like, I had something to share and that I had a voice that needed to be used. And her name was Kathy Cromiller. She's no longer with us. So I do a lot of my advocacy work in honor of her, my original mentor for advocacy. But she asked me to speak to a legislator by the name of Ben Brown. And this was back in the late 80s. And we were seeking funding for the more funding to be used that came from the Child Care Development Block Grant to help children that were less fortunate. And he looked at me straight in the eye and he says, well, I'm not going to approve another nickel for childcare until you can prove that it's quality. And I thought,
Oof.
boy, that's, that it wasn't really a challenge to me because I believed that anyway. I always thought if we do, what's good for the children, the business will come because a big part of business success in childcare is to fill your building and utilize it so
Yes.
that, it can pay the rent, it can pay the salaries. And, uh, so I thought, but to look at it, from his point of view, we had to prove it. And that's when we started
Yes.
inviting legislators, into our schools and, and showing them what we were really doing because we didn't realize that the rest of the world didn't know what we were doing.
Correct. And to piggyback on that, you've hit on two components of the playbook for leaders, number one is communication internally and externally, and to have that brought to the forefront of quality. And another quote that I'm going to attribute to you was when you said you can't pursue making money without being compliant. And you said you have to learn licensing. So, what do licensing and compliance and quality have in common as part of this conversation?
Well, licensing in every state is the foundation, for keeping children safe. And ultimately, over the years, there's also been components added to the quality of early childhood education. And many states have added to their standards or to their quality programs the requirement that you either be accredited by a national organization or you follow their quality rating scale, which actually takes licensing standards to the next level. But the first place to start is always going to be learning to live licensing regulations. Because if you can't learn to live that, then you're knowingly, putting a child at risk. I have never seen regulations that are not there to protect children, and ultimately they are doable. And I actually had opportunities to help write and rewrite regulations throughout my tenure in the state of Oklahoma. And that's another thing, that if you put yourself out there and you show up and you're interested in what's
Yes.
happening, you're going to get an invite to the table. And again, it was always hard for me working for a large company. We had operational goals and financial goals. And I always thought, well, I've got to reach operational goals, because if we don't meet those, there's no reason for us to be here. Well, that included the children, that included licensing, that included, you know, doing developmentally appropriate education. So if we couldn't stay on top of that, then we can't set financial goals and we can't hope to meet them, because it is a very thin margin in this business.
Right.
So, knowing that it's a very thin margin, you have to have a clear plan on how to hold people accountable. You have to have a very clear plan on how to motivate people to want to live licensing. And that's a big part of the communication skills that effective leaders have to have. They
Yes. I need to pause you there, Cindy, because that's gold that I hear so often is licensing is the less interesting part. And let's break that down. What needs to happen at a classroom? What needs to happen on the playground? What needs to happen in your food program? Those are all necessities, but it doesn't give you the same feels as working with the children and they're making their developmental milestones, or your enrollment or your marketing or your branding. They just don't have the same sizzle. However, I think what you're saying here is learning how to live that and motivating your staff so that they see that they play such a vital part in it, as important as that child's developmental milestones. Would you agree that their role in meeting those compliance and licensing and quality standards are right up there with developmental
Oh,
milestones?
absolutely. We have to keep children healthy and safe, and that's what basic licensing is. And we can't. It's like learning to you gotta, you crawl before you walk, and you walk before you run. And again, taking it in steps, and you build upon that, and you start with licensing. I have always preached that. Some of it came from just sheer fear. I didn't want anything to happen to a child in my care.
I don't mean to giggle, but you're absolutely right. It's the avoidance of a
Right.
crisis.
And I didn't want to be
Yeah.
that person that, had to look back and say, well, I should have done a better job of making sure my staff was in compliance, and then also celebrating compliance, because sometimes people, there are people that are still out there that go, well, that's their job. You know what? It is their job, but it's a
Hmm.
hard job. It's a hard job, to keep those children within sight and sound, 100% of the time. And so we have to help
Agreed.
each other know, where do we sit? Where do we stand? And we have to work as a team. And when we accomplish that, and when we transition, because that's when you can lose a child, going from the outside to the inside. And so when we do it right and we do it successfully, we pat each other on the back and we celebrate.
Yes.
But also when we
Yes.
don't do
Agreed.
it the way we have been taught and coached and trained, then we have to sit down with, an individual that may or may not be able to function in this kind of a world, and not let them put them in
Agreed.
jail.
And I think that's a skill, learning crisis management. Everybody plays a role in that, Cindy, when we talk about crisis management, whether you're at the classroom level and you're doing the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, oops, missing one, 1, 2, 3, and the name to face head count. It's that calmness because the children will also react to that. So crisis management, we oftentimes think of big, but even in small situations that could become a big crisis. So as we look at managing crisis, and it can be something small and it can be something big, how do you think we do right down at the classroom level of equipping our teachers to be prepared with crisis, even the small things? But crisis might be an alarming word, but when you think about crisis management, how do you think we're doing as an industry?
Well, I think as an industry, we've all been thrown into an expectation that we will have emergency preparedness. And, that's a requirement from the federal level on down into every state. But I can tell you
Yes.
from working with owners and operators is that sometimes that book is prepared and not shared the way it should be. Or it's, given to a new employee to read along with how many other things. So I think that sometimes people don't think that a crisis is going to happen to them. Um, and that's unfortunate because it has happened to the best of people, to the people who thought they
This is
were
true.
doing everything right, because we are working, with human beings. And I think that keeping crisis management out in front and keeping it part of the discussion, whether it's at meetings or in weekly newsletters or in practice drills that even go beyond the standard, which of course is fire, tornado, someone entering the building that shouldn't be there. There's several different, drills, but at the same time, some of it is just basic to, like, for instance, and I've seen this happen, is a child gets off the playground and is out in the parking lot and is discovered by a parent. That's a crisis. Um,
Right.
and hopefully
Right.
the crisis didn't cause harm to the child. Hopefully it's the kind of crisis that you can learn from and recover from. But then, of course, I think about the crisis of children that have died in vans, in buses. Those
Sure.
are all things that I think people must start realizing that it could happen to them. And how do we
Correct.
keep it
Correct.
from happening? And God forbid, what if it happens? And being fully prepared.
I had a client who shared with me an experience where there had been some fertilizing that had happened, and it was on the playground, and it had been done well enough in advance of the children being out, so it shouldn't have been an issue. However, the company used a crystallized fertilizer that a little child was picking up and putting in their pocket like it was snow. Well, that obviously could have been fatal if consumed, but as soon as it was recognized, they took the necessary actions to get everybody off the playground and to, follow through with medical procedures. But the alertness of that playground teacher who saw what was going on and quickly identified the source of it, everybody immediately was brought in. So it was a crisis avoidance, and thankfully all ended well with that. But it's just that vigilance of making sure that you're making sure that the children are safe at all times. And it goes back to even that opening playground procedure from a licensing perspective. If you had noticed anything, and even if you were vigilant and you didn't notice it, but taking quick action, that's a form of crisis management or crisis avoidance.
Exactly. And just acting swiftly and decisively, and always report to whoever the next person in the chain is,
Thank you.
whether it's teacher to director, or assistant teacher to lead teacher to director, or like in my case, I mean, I know when I was working for a large company, I mean, we went all the way to the top with what we called an urgent issue. And an urgent issue was anything that could put a child at risk, anything at all.
Yep. I love that you said that because I see both sides of the coin. I see the side of the coin where a teacher or a director may not want to expose that there was a liability, like, oh, we handled it. But if it wasn't the way it should have been at the time it should have been completed to meet the quality standard, that's a liability, and upline needs to know about that. So it's balancing that sense of, you have to have complete transparency and honesty so that they're answering the questions that leadership needs in order to identify those gaps. Have you seen that situation
Um,
too in
yes,
your
I have
experience?
seen where people really kind of push it aside, sometimes even to protect maybe a staff member, um, because if a
Yes.
staff member, fails to do, the a process well known in the industry is name to face, especially when you're transitioning
Yes.
from in and outside, and maybe you have one of your best, what you perceive to be one of your best staff members that you know failed to complete that process, and but it allowed for a child to get off the playground, be in the parking lot, and the staff member never missed the child. That's a huge, huge issue. And you have to come you have to come forth because you want to make sure that everybody knows, that needs to know, whether it's parents, childcare licensing, you, and also reach out for help. Like, what do I do in this situation so that we can make it? We can't make it go away, but we can certainly
Yes.
uh, respond to it appropriately, and then react to it appropriately, and then sit down and say, okay, what do we got to do different? I just heard about a center that had a child that did get off the playground and onto the parking lot, a 2-year-old child, and they and the teacher didn't realize it. But ultimately, in going
Mhm.
back and looking, at the root cause, because sometimes teachers are called to another situation, and
Sure.
but the gate and the fence failed this child, and now it
It
wasn't
wasn't
it
locked
wasn't
for whatever
locked, it
sets of
had a
reasons.
gap in it, um, and again, if the teacher had been doing that constant, count and face to name, she might have caught it sooner. And then the parents
Yes.
had found the child wandering on the playground. But at the same time, just reprimanding that teacher, or possibly having to terminate that teacher, depending on the circumstances, um, it wouldn't have fixed the problem. It was completely,
Right.
because there has to be a backup uh, in situations.
Yep.
And the
Agreed.
fence and the gate were very old and really should have been replaced way before it was. Um,
So, to park on that for a minute, we actually help our clients form questions. So when they're doing their checklist, like a pilot does their checklist, a surgeon does their checklist, we have a precious asset, just like passengers and patients, our children are precious assets. So checklists are vital. But the way you ask the question gives you the best information. So, for example, was the gate closed and secure when you open the playground? Yes or no is an answer. If the answer was no, most people will go over and say, oh, I just closed it, or they secure it. But in reality, if it wasn't, you need to know that information. If at the start of the day it wasn't, it's a difference in how you ask the
Right.
question, which gives you different insights to what happened the night before. Did kids come in and play? Or did something happen to the gate since the previous check, the night before check? So those are the way we ask our questions are as important as doing the checklist as well. And I think that's something, I'd love your thoughts on this, but I'm starting to see so much around scorecards and KPIs, which are a way to see how well we're doing. And I applaud that body of work. But if the goal is to get 100%, you might have an inflation or an artificial answer to some of those questions. That's why it's so important of how
Right.
you ask those questions. What's your thought about that? As far as communication, delegation, responsibility, anything you want to take that the direction of that?
Um, I think that one, you're right. It's like how you ask the question, and unfortunately, there's usually a question behind the question, um, that we have to satisfy. And it's not enough. Like for instance, with the playground, it's not enough to say, it is the gate secure? It's almost like, well, how is the gate secure? Because what
Yes.
secure means to you may be different than what it means, to me. And so I know, uh, I actually, when I was a multi-site manager, I had a lot of chain link fences in the centers that I supervised, because in the day, that's what people had. We didn't have vinyl. And so I actually carried with me this long piece of chain and a carabiner and a carabiner.
Yes.
And I would demonstrate that if I went to a school, because I was so fearful a child was going to get hit by a car on the parking lot, or some catastrophic circumstance, or that, to me, that was one of the worst things I felt like I could ever face. And so, it was always kind of surprising to me how blasé so many directors kept it. But it goes back to, like you said, the question is it secure? How is it secured? If it's not secured, what can you do to secure it immediately? I know that's a lot, but we've got to help people think out, the detail
Yes.
of a situation.
Yep.
And I know that's one of the things that I know that uh, has been done with the children dying in buses and cars. And if you think about that, that was a situation where there's been a lot of problem solving, not only at the individual level of a childcare center that it happened in somewhere, um, but all the
Yes.
way up to car makers. My husband just bought a new SUV, and if my purse or a bag of groceries is sitting in the back seat when we turn that car off, it tells us something is in the back seat. So I know that's
Wow.
where that came from. Um, and I think that's the other thing too, is we've got to learn to share crisis and not be afraid to share it, because it could prevent the next one. And I know
Yes.
it's
I
hard
would
to
agree
do
with
that,
that.
but again, we've got to learn, I think, as an industry, and this goes back to finding an organization that you can work within, or finding someone like even One Place Childcare that can help you
Yep.
with ensuring that you go above and beyond to protect children, and and
Yes.
having resources like yours that can help them with that, so that everybody isn't inventing the same wheel.
Agreed, agreed. And I think too that I've been doing a lot of work in this area, and thank you for that comment. So when I talk with owners or administrators or directors or leadership, when do checklists become essential? When does compliance become essential? And typically it's when there's been a
Mhm.
problem. Suddenly something that is maybe three or four on the list suddenly became one. If that incident happened with a child in your care, or with the playground or whatever it happened to be, then it suddenly becomes, we're going to be talking about that as a professional development. um, I actually want to take this one other direction before we wrap for today, but I'm thinking a lot about empathy and how we communicate. And I recently did a leadership workshop where they talked about, is it a problem or is it an opportunity? A problem is a burst pipe, a fire. Those are real problems, but how we communicate to our families and to our staff are an opportunity. Opportunity to teach, opportunity to empathize, opportunity to train. Can you talk about that? I mean, it feels touchy feely, but from a leadership perspective, um, what's your thought? How do you see that in
Well,
practice?
I think that if you're going to be an effective leader, you have to use emotional intelligence to understand the importance of building, strong relationships with people. And you have to show them that you care about them if you want them to pass that
Yes.
caring on. And you've got to be able to put yourself in a position of how does that person feel? And that's empathy. If you can't put yourself in that person's situation and you don't take the time to find out what the situation is, then this is not the industry for you. I do
Right.
think that, you know, I know there's
You're right.
industries that aren't for me. I know that, there are places I would never thrive in, because I don't maybe have the character traits or the characteristics to, be good at that. So unless you can show people that you care, they're never going to pass on the caring. And so getting to know people before something does happen, and maybe
Yes.
making sure that they are able to do the job you're expecting them to do, and hearing them, listening to them, be an active listener. I think in our society today, we're starting to realize that sometimes before a catastrophic event occurs, somebody has suspected that that person needs help. And
Yes.
I think we have to be aware of that. And again, instead of, I guess, being assertive or even aggressive with somebody's shortcomings, we ought to find out what's behind them and how we can help them. But at the same time, make sure that we're not putting a child or a coworker in jeopardy. And one of my number
Mm,
one, I have a top 10 list of what it takes to be successful an ECE in as an ECE business owner or director. And my number one is when in doubt, you have to err on the side of the child. And so often we over empathize. That's another thing you got to be careful of with with a staff member's situation. And it's like we
yes.
allow them, to bark at a child or a group of children. Well, because, her husband just lost their job. Well, I want to empathize with that person, but I can't allow them to bark at the children, because I always say
Yes.
they bark and then they start pulling on arms. And before long, then
Mm,
you've got nurses, somebody has pulled an arm out of a socket. We have to err quickly on the side of the child when we believe something is happening.
yes. That discernment is vital to the safety of the children. And also, you think about the domino effect of, even with children, it's more of an adult saying they don't always remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made
Right.
them feel. And so that child or staff member, how they feel can then be the domino effect of they then turn around and treat somebody in the same way that they have emotion about a certain situation. So I can see this really being an important conversation, and I'm sure that it is. But I'm noticing more and more that as we bring younger, not even younger, just new people into the industry, it doesn't necessarily have to be younger, but as we bring people into the early education space that didn't come necessarily from early education, it's just teaching those nuances of that empathetic, active listening for the benefit of the child, but also knowing when to intervene to prevent something that could potentially snowball into a bigger
And
issue.
a lot of times that's just sitting people down and asking them, you know, what can I do to help you? I noticed, that you're not yourself today. Are you feeling okay? And let them, open up, and instead of, just responding, I can't let you do that. I can't hear your voice, your loud voice again. I mean, it's just how you approach solving the problem. And again, that will roll downhill the way you want it to if you do what's right towards them.
And that very conversation, Cindy, that you just cited could very well have resulted in retaining a staff and or moving that staff into a different position if there's something frustrating about the role that they're playing. They might be quote unquote right bus,
Yes.
wrong seat. So those conversations are essential to be having. I'd love to see your top 10. Maybe you can share that with me. But the top 10, I think that's something that um, replicating that success because of the years that you've had, and not only being, starting back to the beginning of our conversation, being a lifelong learner. It is absolutely true that we're learning new ways of doing things. And sometimes we don't talk about this all that often, but sometimes we have to unlearn the way we've done
Oh,
things
yes.
so that we
I
can
just
learn.
had an experience. I took, I don't know if you've heard about the class assessment. Okay. I
I
took the
have.
training for that. It's a resource being used in my home state. And then I was working with a friend of mine who her state is now requiring it. And so, and I do some consulting with her. So I actually took the course. And one of the things that the instructor, there was a little bit of a conflict in my mind because, I grew up on Itters and Eckers, you know, and
Hmm.
then of course accreditation has been, a huge part of my life in the last, you know, 20 years. And then of course, individual states that I've worked in that have had quality ratings, scale requirements. And ultimately there was something that was causing me a little conflict in how to handle a behavior situation, and we were discussing it in the class, and she said, well, you just have to learn to look at the classroom through the eyes of class and not all of the other uh, pieces, you know. And I was
Interesting.
like, I would like to marry them. That would be my tendency because, Itters and Eckers still really sets up a nice classroom, environment. And accreditation looks at health and safety, child teacher interactions, how centers are set up. And I'm like, how can we bring all this together? That was what I wanted to do. Um, but
Yes, I can see that. I can see that. And I'll ask one last question here while we wrap, and then do you think though there will be a time in our lifetime where we will have a nationwide quality accreditation and licensing standard? Do you envision that happening as it has in other countries?
I don't hear the kind of discussion I would like to hear about that. And there are so many people that would like to see that happen. I think we make it way too difficult and we give too many opportunities to recipients of the Child Care Development Block Grant. We give each state, again, their opportunity to determine so many ways of doing business. And one of the things I encountered in my career that I would love to see corrected, and this would only come through federal, state standards and guidelines, is that if you live in Michigan, for example, and you go to a child care center and you're 2 years old, there's going to be one teacher for every 4 children. But if you live by licensing regulations, but if you live
Yeah,
in Florida, there's going to be one teacher for every 11 2 year olds. Now, I can't even breathe when I think about that. And I know when I was
I know.
supervising in Florida, I intentionally uh, lo- lowered that to 1 to 8 because that's an average and it's doable. It's not as good as 1 to 4, but 8 to 1. And I would love to see us take at least uh, some, again, ratios, but then two, we have to back it up. We can't have an unfunded mandate. So we've got to bring these
Yes.
things together. And we are starting to hear conversations, as far as the legislators are concerned, is that there are some policies that need to change at the federal level in order for some legislators, to even think about putting more funding in. So it goes back to that conversation I had
Yes.
right. It's like, we're not going to do this until
We're not spending another nickel
we
until
improve
fill in the
quality.
blank.
So I don't know if we'll
Yeah.
see it. It seems like it takes a long time for things to evolve, and that conversation really just started to surface, you know, uh, because so much was learned during COVID by people who didn't take an interest in what was really happening. And now we have legislators asking questions, and we have parents asking
Yes.
questions. And I think
That
that's the
they are.
beginning. Whether I'll live to see it, I don't know, but I'll keep talking until, I can't talk anymore, and maybe we'll find a way to get
Well,
there together.
well, Cindy, you're very special and your passion continues to shine through, and you found other ways to pour out and give back. And that's part of what I appreciate about you, your advocacy work, your experience, your transparent conversations, your willingness to help and to learn. You're a great role model and want to thank you for the time today.
Well,
Much
thank you for all
appreciated.
you're doing to try to make it easier for directors that are out there, especially on their own, that don't have some of the resources of larger companies who do create checklists and things. But I also think big companies could benefit. It brings it all together. So anything I can do, to help the cause, because what we do today affects the next 7 generations. And
Wow, that's
I
powerful.
lived in Oklahoma for 30 years, and I had the opportunity to learn a lot about Native Americans. And that is an old Native American wisdom. And I get goosebumps every time I think about it. So that's kind of
Wow.
what I'm hoping to affect, is the next 7 generations. But I have lots of friends and organizations, doing the same, but we need more of our childcare owners to also join in the conversation. They're the boots on the ground, and they are feeling you know, the pain and the challenge, and they want to do better, but we got to help them. We really do.
I hear you loud and clear on that. And I do also take the opportunity to say, find out who if you do have a child care association, become a member or find out who your legislators are, connect with them on what the key issues are, find out what's coming up for vote and learn. Even if they feel like, well, politics isn't my thing, it isn't about politics, it's about advocacy. So
Well, thank you. I hope I'm pretty, I don't really, I don't really change my mind on much at this point unless I do learn a better way. And often when I learn a better way, then I put it out there. But and I'm always listening.